son. Where'd you find this?
Buckle up, buttercups. It's time to get down to business. Oh, yeah. It's the Totally Legitimate Business Podcast. Totally legit.
All right, folks, it's the Totally Legitimate Business Podcast. We're back here again, and we've got a pretty wild episode. Joining us is Doireann from Blessed Butt on TikTok, and she's here to tell us about some pretty wild stuff relating to ancient sites and their possible true uses. Welcome to the show.
Thanks a ton for having me, James. I'm stoked to get into all this.
I am too. And when Andrew put me onto these clips, I love the ancient history stuff. But for me, I've always looked at it like, what are the practical uses of these spaces? They can't all be stargates. You know what I mean? So when I saw your stuff, I was immediately drawn in because of a lot of sensible context it adds to these sites. My first question for you is, how do you even get involved in looking and analyzing ancient sites? And then how do you get to we're looking at it wrong and we should be looking at it this way?
Right. So that's a great question. I originally started to do a deeper dive with ancient Egypt. That was sort of my starting point. I've had a fair amount of free time in the last year, just I was unemployed for quite some time. I work in tech. And as you know, it's kind of a crazy market. So I was unemployed for quite some time and got sucked back into thinking and looking at ancient Egypt. And I noticed that there is this sort of romanticization of ancient Egypt, and it was such a long period of time. And I just started to do sort of a deeper dive, and I never bought into, these alien theories and these pseudoscience theories, and I just wanted to, find something more concrete for myself and my understanding. I told a friend about this, and they suggested that I look into Gobekli Tepe. And within about 48 hours of doing research, I had sort of came up with my own theory in regards to Gobekli Tepe. And I thought, why don't I look into Stonehenge? And then I looked into Stonehenge, and it sort of catapulted into a whole bunch of research in terms of archaeological structures and what their original purpose and intent was. They may have, grown into religious and really meaningful structures, but I was finding in my research that it is also very likely that these structures started off and their original intent was very practical and sensible. And my theories are not based in pseudoscience. They're all based in logical conclusions. That's sort of my slogan, so to speak, is I'm here to find logical conclusions, and I did find also in my research one of my main arguments is that the ceremonial or religious determinations that archaeologists tend to make don't always reflect the primary intentional intent of these structures. More often than not, these ceremonial determinations are based on lack of evidence rather than the presence of it. They're usually the default determination for these structures when there isn't enough evidence.
Sure.
But I think there's a lot of red lines for archaeologists and protocol they have to follow. And the cool part about not being an expert and being a student of life, so to speak, is that you can use all of these journals that are really accessible, and there's just so many journals out there to look through. We can use these to make a broader conclusion without being necessarily confined in the same way an archaeologist might be. And we have so much available to us, and these stories, I also argue, are really filled with so much knowledge from our collective ancestors. And they could hold a lot of answers and messages to us that would be important for the future to pass along to future generations. And I also always remind myself when I'm doing this sort of research that the most important thing is that we've always been human. Evolution takes an incredibly long time to happen, and our past selves we're very connected to, even though right now, currently, we view ourselves in the past as sort of this mythical, vague thing. But we've always been human. We've always been doing human things.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And really, like, as your story of this evolved, it just begins to make more and more sense. I guess let's start with Stonehenge. Let's just jump right into this, and this was the first thing I got put onto. Again, Andrew had sent me these videos, but this sucked me in immediately just because of how much absolute sense it makes.
Yeah, let's get into it. So Stonehenge, a lot of people have this conception of Stonehenge as, being a relatively small community, and also we have this concept that it's just these stones. But Stonehenge is really part of a much larger landscape of different earthworks that are nearby, and there were recent discoveries as recent as 2000 and 2022 around the area, which I'll be getting into as well. I'll share my screen. So Stonehenge is this little tiny star here, if you can see my cursor. Are you able to see my cursor?
Yeah, we got your cursor. Yep.
Okay, cool. So this Stonehenge is this little tiny star here, but in the surrounding areas, we have several different earthworks, and we have pits as well. So 2 miles northeast of Stonehenge over here in Durrington Walls. Durrington Walls is named after a very large earthwork, a henge, one of the largest. I think it actually is the largest henge in Britain, is Durrington Wall Henge. In this area, we also have pits that were recently discovered. These are underground pits. There's also Woodhenge, which is a small little thing here, but it's not small. It's very large. Woodhenge is basically this circular and inner. I can show you. This structure that were very small pits that once held timber, and these were all wood. It's debated whether or not there was covering on top, but this is its own sort of Stonehenge, except it's Woodhenge.
Wood, yeah.
And that's right there. So here's a closer image. That's in Durrington Walls, and in Durrington Walls we also have a bunch of underground pits here. There's also this cursus. This is an earthwork that's very, very, very large. And I'm going to pull up some figures here. The cursus is 1.9 miles long, and it's 490 feet wide. There's also this avenue that is considered an earthwork as well. It's less defined than the cursus, though. There's also something in Durrington Walls over here called the Robin Hood's Ball. Oh, where's my cursor? There it is. Robin Hood's Ball. And there's also causeway enclosures as well. Stonehenge was originally a causeway enclosure, which is important to note. So keep that in mind for later. So Woodhenge was actually, in terms of timeline, Woodhenge was constructed around the same time or later than Stonehenge. The causeways and Robin Hood's Ball were possibly older. And the cursus is from 3600 BC. Originally, we discovered totems and markers that date back to 7500 BC. Those are like the earliest pieces of evidence we have from this area.
Sure.
And in terms of actual structure, though, the first thing that we see are the causeway enclosures and the cursus, which was 3600 BC.
And what, just as a legend, what are the green dots on this map?
I am not entirely certain. Let's see if it says it on the bigger.
If there's a legend or something. No legend. Who does that?
They might
Maybe
just be
it's like
hills.
artifacts or
They might just be geographical hills.
Gotcha.
Entirely sure. The cursus was built and took over 1 million hours of work to build this cursus. They had to dig into chalk. There's like raw chalk underneath the landscape, and it's not easy to work with. The amount of labor that this took was incredible.
Incredible,
we do know that a lot of what was going on at Durrington Walls was feast related. So we do already know that. And one of the arguments that I make is that Stonehenge was a direct part of this feasting process, that this entire remnants of this community, or this society rather, is related to primarily food and food preservation. So just to talk a bit about Durrington Walls. Durrington Walls, the pits were discovered in 2020. So just 4 years ago, we discovered these enormous circle of 20 pits in Durrington Walls, and they follow this circle here. It's a circle circuit of 20 pits. They're 33 feet wide each and 15 feet deep. Like, these were massive pits. And we know for a fact and for certain that they were used for storing food and keeping food cool and dry. There are remnants of food products within these pits. There's also containers and vessels. There's a high proportion of pig to cattle was found in here. So in terms of food, they were predominantly eating pig. The ratio was something like 10-1. Let me just pull up the numbers again. Yep, it's 10-1 in terms of what food was being consumed. Pig and cattle.
That's a lot of pig.
Predominantly pig. Yeah. And we also know that they had vessels of varying size with dairy remnants and pork fat. They also used distinct vessels and distinct locations for these items. So everything was deliberate. They were not packaged and placed by random. It was sort of like a factory. They were very deliberate with their storing of food. It was not random at all. So the milk and dairy products were in smaller vessels, and other other items like pig fat, etc., were in larger vessels and in specific areas. We also know that the people during this time were lactose intolerant, so they had to be processing their milk and their dairy and their cheese and their butter. Cheese and butter were also found as well, remnants. So they were processing milk. This was not a hunter-gatherer society as is.
It was a full-fledged operation.
Yeah, this was like a full-fledged operation. This was not, hunter-gatherers eating every single day as they were able. So this suggests that they were very developed in their food production. I also just wanted to quickly note something that isn't in any of my TikToks, which I discovered in preparation for this, is that there was a fair amount of charcoal that was found in one of the causeway enclosures in Durrington Walls. charcoal and ash from several different trees. They found quite a bit of it. This could suggest that they were making soap from pig fat.
Yeah.
And that's pretty remarkable. Soap to clean clothes, not necessarily hygienic soap, but that could suggest that they were making soap, seeing that much ash and charcoal, which I haven't seen in any journals, but that's just something that
Interesting development. Yeah.
I was thinking of. Yep. Let's see. And then, so we know that they were fat siphoning. There was a tremendous amount of fat, so much fat that it has been suggested that they were using fat to move the stones, like to slip and slide the stones.
As a lubricant. Yeah, sure.
Which you know, from the amount that we see, I can see how that would be a thing. But I think that they could have also been using a lot of that fat for soap making as well, since
Sure.
Stonehenge was not erected overnight. It went through various changes throughout the thousands of years that it was there, and they were changing it and moving it up until around 1500 BC. So Stonehenge made a lot of changes, and the stones were never 100% complete either, in terms of like their placement. So let's get into the stones a little bit. So now we're over here.
For sure.
Let me see if I missed any.
And how do you know like how big supposedly this civilization of people was, like that would have been running this massive operation of pig farming?
Right. So during the Neolithic and Bronze eras, our estimates of how many people here are not accurate, but they said it's agreed that it was around 4,000. So not that large, but this is just based off of the dwellings in Doireann walls.
Right.
So it's estimated around 4,000 to begin with. We do not know what they grew into or what they developed into. But in terms of the dwellings, it's estimated around 4,000. But our knowledge of how many people were here is limited.
Sure.
Unreliable. We can't say for sure.
Definitively something is this number. Yeah.
Exactly. But we do know that there were a lot of houses and dwellings around Doireann walls. But one thing to note is that the pigs that were found, and again, predominantly pig remains in terms of food that they were eating and consuming, but these pigs came from all over. So people were coming in from all over with their pigs, and that's the other thing that we're not exactly certain about is how they were transported, because pigs aren't the easiest to herd.
Yeah.
But they were all from elsewhere, and a lot of the human remains and burials contain remains of humans from other locations as well. So this wasn't necessarily like a settlement. It was for those that lived in Doireann walls, but
sure, but it was also a hub.
This was like
it was a hub for something else. Yeah,
exactly. And we'll see other hubs as well as we go on. I just wanted to show you also. So over here, Woodhenge, this star, that's one recreation of it. One three-dimensional recreation of it. And as we get into Stonehenge, I'll be talking a lot about light and shadow, and just keep this in mind as well as we get into Stonehenge. And this is Doireann walls again. That's Woodhenge. Just to give you an idea of just how large Doireann walls is. This is Doireann walls henge, and then the pits are. Let's see if I can show you where the pits are. They're around the ring, so they're around Doireann walls, and they make they make a circle circuit around the actual henge that's there. And then here we have Stonehenge. This is a mapping of Stonehenge from above. And all around here, these numbered circles are small little pits that could have contained timber. It's disputed whether or not they did, but based off of Woodhenge and what we see from these holes here, I argue that these absolutely did contain timber.
Yeah.
And the stones inside here, let's get another photo. So it went through different periods of construction, and these were stones that were altered and moved throughout time. Oh, and this is just to give you an idea of just how large the Cursus is.
Yeah.
Which again is just north of Stonehenge, 450 feet wide, and 1.9 miles. And this is where the human remains, where they were found. So people were the burials that were uncovered, the human remains. People were really coming from all over. Let's get into shadow stuff. Okay, so here's this is an aerial view of Stonehenge. Because of its location, its proximity to Durrington Walls, where we know that they were storing quite a large amount of pig. It's just 2 miles away. We know that they were using donkeys for transportation. I argue that I don't think it's a far-fetched idea to assume that Stonehenge played a role in this and potentially played a role in the preparation of all of this pig. So I sort of thought about, why would shadow be important here? Why would light and shadow be important? Because we know that it was celestially aligned to some degree. Well, definitely not to some degree.
Yeah, right.
Very,
for sure.
very
It for sure was.
actually. But how this could have been used on a day-to-day and why this would have been important on a day-to-day rather than some abstract connection to the stars. And so we can see that there's quite a bit of shadow, and the stones themselves are temperature controlled. All of them have the ability to absorb heat and release it back slowly, so keeping the surrounding area cool and stable. The stones are sarsen stone as well as bluestone predominantly. The altar stone is made of a red sandstone that's particularly absorbent, which is important. So if they were processing pig within here and stringing up on lines, they could maximize cooling with the shadow and the stone, potentially. So this is sort of a little depiction of like how shadow works throughout the year in terms of sun and in terms of these stones. So during the summer, the sun is high up in the sky, meaning it's going to cast less of a shadow. And during the winter, you have much longer, elongated shadows, which could allow for more meat to be processed and be kept cool. So to show you sort of an example of what I'm talking about, these Aubrey holes would have contained timber. We know from the construction of Stonehenge that they were extremely knowledgeable on the physics of using rope. So in terms of lifting all of these stones and maneuvering all of this stone, we get a picture of just how in-depth their knowledge was on physics, on lifting things, pulley systems,
Sure.
all of that in terms of rope. So for me, I was like, of course, they would make use of this in other ways as well. Why wouldn't they be stringing up, pig and other items and making use of the coolness as they're distributing the meat? This cursus here, which is not technically a cursus, it's an earthwork, could potentially be areas in which the pig were dropped off or picked up. I have this other image as well that shows the shadow and how it would move throughout the day. So this is not realistic, because if these were full pigs, like, it would be too much weight.
Sure.
But if they were pieces of pig, just imagine that they're like lighter. But this is sort of what I imagined would happen. So the sun rises on the east, meaning it's casting the shadow right over here, which would make sense. There are these 4 mounds where they could have been. This stone is technically on a mound. They can step up on the stone and maybe tie the rope.
Yeah.
We also know that this community made use of hooks, which was always presumed to be for fishing only. But I suggest that hooks were also used in sort of this context as well.
Sure.
With
Yeah.
tying or stringing up the rope. In terms of tension, this inner horseshoe is much taller than the surrounding ring of stone, making the tension really perfect for stringing something up and keeping things cool on the inside. They also they have found burned ashes here as well. They could have also been smoking. One thing to note is that all of the pig found that had been smoked had all the same exact burn marks at the same exact place.
Wow.
So very, very consistent, which this would also...
Factory setting. Yeah.
Exactly. This is like very deliberate processing. And in terms of pig, as you know, we can easily get sick from pig. So having something like this food preservation system would prevent illness as well and cross-contamination. Having pigs strung up is much safer than processing on items. Just in terms of cross-contamination, it also makes the pig and the meat more tender. And it also could have been used in this way to siphon that fat, that we know that they had so much fat. The majority of the pigs are also baby pigs, which is reflective of their knowledge of farming in general.
Husbandry.
Pigs sometimes die early, so it's good to basically
get them while you can.
Process baby pigs as well as adult pigs, because not all of the pigs are going to make it to adulthood. So that is reflective of their knowledge of this whole processing system. I'm a software engineer by trade. There's a data structure called FIFO or FIFO, first in, first out, which originally came from grocery stores and food preservation.
Yep.
The first that goes into the store should be the first that goes out of the store, essentially. So the expiration date of the milk that's remaining essentially will always be good to go. So the first in is the first out. And this system could have functioned like a first in, first out system in terms of pig, and getting it to Durrington Walls, where the smoked or cut up and processed meat was transferred over to Durrington Walls, or to people picking up their pig and their meat. One thing that I found actually in the preparation for this is that, which is just really wild is the animals were killed with blows, but they found that quite a bit of them were from a distance. So it suggested that there might have been games played.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, hunting games. Yeah.
Which could make more sense for, let's bring it back to the cursus.
Yeah.
This might have something to do with the game.
Like a game complex with the field. Yeah, sure.
Potentially. And this also could have just been, a pasture to keep pigs in temporarily while people had just made this journey to have their pig processed and kept away or distributed, or for celebration, funerals, which we know that they were having. But this could have been a place to keep their personal pigs, roaming, potentially, but it also could have been where they were killing the pigs and then bringing them over to, let's look at the map again, bringing them over to Stonehenge for processing. So not that far. And then this is where they would go for potentially longer term storing, which smoked meat can be stored underground for quite some time. And especially if this community was, all working together, we do have a general idea that there was at least some hierarchy,
Sure. But structure, I mean, definitely, even if we're entertaining the idea that this is a factory, it would require that people would be organized and there'd be a hierarchy and, single-mindedly fixed on the goal of everyone participates in getting food. We process food here. That's what we do.
Right. And we know that, those that were at the remains of people that were at Durrington Walls were consuming, a lot of the same food. One thing also to mention is they weren't getting rid of. I'm so sorry. So one thing to note is that they weren't making use of every single thing. So they had an abundance, essentially.
Yeah. So they had enough to where they could have waste. Yeah.
Exactly. So we see these remnants of bones, so many bones where the marrow is, still intact. They weren't making use of every single thing. They had waste, which means they were living pretty abundantly, which also, they could have had room for games and celebration and creativity involved in this. I just thought that was really interesting with the finding out that the blows were from a distance for some of these pigs. I just thought that was very interesting because that doesn't necessarily fully fit into this idea of this being fully food preservation preparation.
Yeah.
And this is called the slaughter stone. This one stone here is enormous. It's not really the heel stone is absolutely enormous. You don't really get a good picture of it here. But this altar stone here, I suggest could have been one of many of these smaller stones as well. Could have been used as sort of hooks for the rope to pull over this taller stone and right over, let me show you, right over it, which would provide quite a nice tension, just physically looking at it. If there were a rope going over that, it would make for a great tension right along this area, which would be ideal if you were stringing up meat, and that meat could then go through any one of these holes, areas here. These are wide holes, not these holes. the slits in these the inner horseshoe are really small. You wouldn't really be able to fit anything through there. But
Sure.
you'd be able to fit them through these outer slots. They're very, very large. And again, there are these locations here that would potentially serve as like hoisting or hopping up and changing the rope depending on where the shadow is throughout the day. Oh, and just to give you an idea, it's estimated that around 30,000 people were living in Britain entirely. And again, that's just an estimate because it's hard for us to know. Just how many people were there during the Neolithic and Bronze era.
Sure.
But I would suggest that those estimates are modest. And if there were 30,000 people living in Britain, this seems to be like it was the
pig farm.
Central location for people to
Yeah.
go.
Yeah. The pig, where you go to take your pig to get processed and buy all sorts of other pig processing byproducts. Yeah, no, for sure. It completely tracks.
And not necessarily buying, but trading, and coming together. And there absolutely could have been religious connotations to this. And there was, a lot of beliefs and mythical beliefs and religions that followed this in the area. So that could have developed absolutely. But in terms of primary use, I always say it was probably to do with food.
Well, again, it's like, what does a culture at this point in time, what's its main concern? Food.
Exactly.
Why would they spend so much time and effort erecting these types of sites just to do ceremonies at them occasionally? No, they spent that time and energy to do that so they could supply food en masse. That's an explanation that makes complete sense.
Exactly.
Stargate, I've never felt that, especially about Stonehenge, but I've never felt that. But this is like the best interpretation of what is going on here.
Yeah, and it's exactly right. Like, the calorie expenditure, if you think about it from an energy point of view and an energy perspective, this energy to bring these stones, which came from all over. This is something that I didn't mention. These stones came from all over. The altar stone, the center stone, which is just this, you can't really see it, but it's right here. It's a very large stone and it's very porous. It's made of red sandstone. It came from 450 miles away in Scotland. We know this from isotope testing, that it came 450 miles. All of this energy and deliberate purpose, it had to have been for something that was sustaining,
Yeah, no, it had to serve a daily functional purpose.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
Yeah, that is just so wild. Again, like hearing it in spelled out long form, it's just like, it just makes so much sense. So, okay, so you spend all this time looking into Stonehenge. At what point do you start branching out and seeing similarities in other places?
Right, so I started thinking about light a lot, and shadow, and where we see henges repeat. And there are so many henges that I can't even fully get into, and earthworks that we see in and around Europe, Wales, or the UK, Wales, Ireland, Scotland. We see a lot of henges. And I looked into Newgrange, which also has some mystery involved. I was thinking a fair amount about light and shadow, and looking into other mounds and structures in and around this area. and I looked into Newgrange. I had heard about Newgrange, but my understanding and knowledge of it was very limited. I was not really aware of just how large it was and also just how aligned it was. And I also had no idea how many stones were involved. So I was thinking about light, shadow, and stone, and temperature control in regards to stone. So with Stonehenge, they were deliberately chosen, these stones. They came from so many miles away. Even the blue stone and the sarsen stone are still 15. They came from 15 miles away at least. And we know that they were making dugout canoes and boats, so it's possible that they were transported that way.
Utilizing water, yeah.
So I was thinking a lot about, why were these stones chosen? Why wasn't, chalk chosen? That was very abundant in the area. Why wasn't, other stones that are already in the area chosen? And a lot of the stones that were deliberately chosen and brought in are very weather resistant. They're going to last a long time. This was very much thinking into the future. What will last a long time? What will sustain us the longest? What will also control the temperature around it? And this could have been discovered on a much smaller scale. People having, small underground containers within their homestead that they're realizing, oh, this stone will keep things cooler. If I keep this little stone with this little piece of poultry, it'll keep for longer. Smaller scale testing led to larger scale innovation. That's how I kind of see it.
Sure. And
so going into Newgrange, we have this just absolutely stunning work made of so many stones underneath this that are all deliberate. And there is an inner hall and chamber, several small chambers inside. This is located in Ireland. This is where not exactly the spot, but my ancestors are from Ireland. Not quite this area, but it's just really, really enormous.
You can see the scale. There's a couple people out in front, and they're just microscopic. They look like ants.
Exactly, and it's one of many that are like this in and around Ireland and Wales. And these the stones that were used to make it consist of granodiorite, siltstone, and gabbro, and they all have along with more different quartz and different stones as well. But they're all deliberately structured. So the more weather resistant stones are on the external area and directly underneath it. And the more cooling and temperature regulating and absorbent stones are inside in these chambers, where I argue that food and grain were stored. Keeping food stored also underground keeps it cool as well, and it prevents rodents and smaller creatures from getting to it. There were several things found within Newgrange, but they were all much, much further along in its history. So it was likely changed throughout time in terms of what it was used for and why.
Sure.
I argue that its initial construction was for keeping food stored and cooled, and we know that it's celestially aligned in this perfect, precise manner. So light floods the inner chamber for 17 minutes during the winter solstice, and that's it. It is dark the entire time except for these 17 minutes. And I was listening to this great podcast with this Newgrange specialist, and he was talking about it, and I absolutely agreed with him. He was talking about just how precise and deliberate it was, but his focus was a lot on the light. And I think I focus on the dark of this. This was constructed to maximize darkness, I think.
For sure.
This little moment that could have possibly even been circumstantial. That this little bit of moment was circumstantial, or it was deliberate for brightening the space when they would need it. So they would go in during winter solstice to retrieve,
take inventory or some
summer grains that they
had. Sure. That makes total sense.
The winter. Sorry, what was that?
That makes total sense. Yeah. Absolutely.
And so and this also connects with it also connects with some of the history and mythology that we see coming out of Ireland after this time too. This is often connected, even the name of it in Irish, which is not Newgrange, is connected to the Tathta, which Tathta is the tribe of gods, and the mythos around. I can't speak in great detail about it because it's sort of a whole other conversation. Thing. But the mythos surrounding it pertains to the controlling of time. A lot of the stories and myths in regards to these gods, which were not good and they were not bad, but a lot of the stories regard time and the controlling of time, which I just think is interesting because when you put something in storage and then you come back to it and it's preserved in some way, you are locking
it in time. 100%.
Like time travel situation. So I thought that was interesting. And just in terms of Irish history, this could have been really important just in terms of storing food and keeping food, and drink items as well. They found grave goods and votive offerings within, as well as unburned human remains. So it's possible that this had become
like a morgue,
a site of it could have become like a royal site. They found the remains that they found were of a person whose parents were brother and sister, which suggests that they were royalty of some sort. Which is kind of interesting that it could have started as a communal space and then was taken over. That is suggested, but it's not. We don't know really.
Sure.
But I like to think that this space was originally more communal. And we see similar spaces to this much later on in terms of the Pueblo culture. We see Kivas that are similar shapes and structures, but we'll get into that in a little bit.
Again, it's like that took a lot of time to build that. Exactly. That had to have served a practical purpose. Otherwise, they wouldn't have spent the time to build it. And especially building it in the way that they did.
Exactly. And the stones, again, they're coming from all over. There's also river cobblestones, just so much traveling with these stones,
Super deliberate.
Super deliberate. And they found several animals inside, but they likely entered after.
Sure.
So it's really hard to say, but inside the stones, I'm going to try to pull up a better photo. Inside the stones, they are almost like these tables that look like they were slabs holding what could have potentially been quite a bit of food. And there are several compartments within it. And there are several carvings of spirals within it. So this is sort of like what I'm talking about. This is just so deliberate.
Right.
And we also have these
I see the spiral carvings. Gotcha.
everywhere on the inside and outside as well, which to me connects a lot with the mythos that evolved from this area later that we so we don't know, but to me it connects sort of to this idea of time and controlling time with this passageway.
Sure.
Just also to give you an idea of like what it looks like when it lights up. Oh, that's a different one. But it lights up like this for 17 minutes inside, which would be the perfect amount of time to go in on winter solstice and retrieve food and come out.
Sure. That's
yeah.
crazy.
And yeah, so I was definitely this was one of my last and most recent stops on my journey here, my learning journey here. But my learning journey never stops. But in terms of my archaeological deep dives, Stonehenge and Newgrange followed Gobekli Tepe, which I'll be talking about now. This was actually the second stop on my archaeological journey here. So this is the second stop. I had been talking about ancient Egypt with a friend. He said, "Why don't you look into Gobekli Tepe?" And I said, "Sure." And 2 days of research, I started to understand that the consensus around Gobekli Tepe might not actually be accurate. So Gobekli Tepe is one of the oldest archaeological sites that we know of, and it dates back to 9500 BC in Turkey, between 9000 and 9500 BCE in Turkey. And it should also be noted that the community that was at Stonehenge, they were immigrants, and they descended from immigrants that came in from Turkey. So it is very possible that some of the descendants from Gobekli Tepe ended up in Britain and ended up specifically in and around Stonehenge.
Interesting.
That lineage is not
fully defined.
It is also possible that they're just from around Turkey, not necessarily Gobekli Tepe area.
Sure.
But we do know that the Stonehenge community were predominantly from immigrants from Turkey.
Interesting.
So let's get into it. This is sort of a mapping of the 4 main enclosures. There are more enclosures, though. This is not the extent of Gobekli Tepe, but these are the 4 enclosures that there have been the majority of the research that I've looked into are on. There's also enclosure F and enclosure H, which are not here, that there's ongoing research on right now. And so these enclosures, you don't really get a good picture of it with this mapping, but go ahead and show you. This is inside of one of the enclosures. This is sort of the scale. This is a depiction of what it looked like when they were building it out. They built each enclosure at different times. So one of the arguments that I make is they built each enclosure as their population grew and as their needs changed and grew.
Sure.
And this is another good depiction with a person inside, so you can get an idea of scale. They are inset and underground partially. So these come out of the ground essentially. So they're underground, which provides cooling. I was thinking, what could this have been used for? I read a lot about the community that was there. There's evidence that they were domesticating dogs. There's a tremendous amount of evidence of the amount of butchering and food eating they were doing. So there was this was considered a feasting area. They have also been described as a death cult by some archaeologists that argue that this was some sort of death cult, that they were killing animals and sacrificing each other, because there are painted skulls of humans in these enclosures. Not a ton, but they did find skulls that were painted, and that led archaeologists to believe that it might be a death cult. I do not agree with that at all.
Yeah.
I believe that these structures, again, the energy expenditure to make them, this took a very long time to make each one of them, and it was very deliberate. I argue that this was, again, for a purposeful and practical purpose. They're circular structures, and these pillars that we see in all of them, each pillar that are these T-shaped pillars, they're all made of limestone. Limestone, I wanted to know more about the stone itself and if it would serve a purpose. Because I had been looking into Egypt prior to looking into Gobekli Tepe, I was curious if it served some sort of purpose with metals, if there were metals involved in this community, but they really were not using metal, not at all to the same degree as ancient Egypt. They were not using metal. They were using a lot of materials like clay and ochre. They were using a ton of ochre, actually, which I'll get into a little bit later. But I wanted to figure out why limestone was purposefully chosen and why it was a T-shape, because we see the T-shape in every single enclosure.
Every single one of them, yeah.
And the enclosures look like more or less the same. They're just different sizes and slightly different
configurations.
Configurations, exactly.
Yeah.
But they're more or less the same. So to me, that signaled it worked. What they were designing first worked, and they're making more and more. So in terms of population, it would make sense that this had to do with food. So I looked into why limestone and if it interacted with anything in their environment. And limestone does indeed interact with rainwater. When rainwater comes in contact with limestone, it produces CO2. There's a reaction and it produces CO2. And so I got to thinking, what if this was used as food preservation? We know that they were hunting a fair amount. They were a big hunting community. That's why the death cult connection was made by these archaeologists. So they were killing a fair amount of animals, and we know that they were butchering large animals as well, like auroch and lion. And they would need a fair amount of space to prepare and store and keep that meat.
Sure.
So that's sort of the jump that I made, is what if this this space was utilizing CO2 in some way. We know that they were using clay. They could have potentially had clay enclosures around this limestone that also made use of other natural materials, maybe not entirely clay because clay is pretty heavy. They could have been using other natural materials to make sort of, let me give you a good example. So I started to imagine sort of what this would look like. This is one of the enclosures. I think this is enclosure B, but I'm not sure. Yeah, this is enclosure A or B. But this is one of the smaller enclosures. This structure itself prevents rodents or any critters from getting in, and they're also elevated. If you can see, there's quite a bit of height here before there's a space.
Right.
That is, again, contained by limestone. So if there was a covering surrounding this area, and water with ochre, which is also an acid, like rainwater or ochre water poured over this area would seep down into the limestone. It's very, very absorbent. Limestone is incredibly absorbent. It would seep down and produce CO2. And anytime you have meat that is just sitting out, it's producing CO2. So CO2 would be produced by the meat that was kept within as well as from the limestone. And I was not able to do that math myself, so I consulted a couple of different AI bots, which I'm not the biggest fan of AI, but I put in measurements and dimensions and was able to get a pretty consistent answer in terms of the amount of CO2 parts per I think it's millimeter ppm. So the ppm would be enough to prevent or delay spoilage for meat. That's one possibility, but also limestone is incredibly absorbent, keeps things dry, and it also keeps things cool. So limestone is another temperature controlling stone, meaning it absorbs heat and then releases it slowly, keeping the surrounding area stable in terms of temperature, which is great for smoking and great for cooling or keeping
things cool. Yeah.
Exactly. And so this is sort of the setup that I imagined for these spaces. And when you go into each of these enclosures, you'll find depictions of animals, which in a lot of the archaeological research and journals that I've read are often connected to rituals, etc. And I argued that this could have been indicators. These could have been indicators for each enclosure. Each enclosure housed
this kind of product.
This meat. Not necessarily, that they were selling, but they could have been trading. This is several very large enclosures, and they're also celestially aligned to some degree, not in the same way that we see, with Stonehenge or Newgrange, but someone suggested online that their celestial alignment could have been so it was easy to find,
right?
And that totally goes with my theory that this was a central meeting location for people from all over, that we see elsewhere as well. But we also know that they were eating primarily gazelle towards the end of the civilization. So the original indicators were not necessarily what, thousands of years later they ended up eating, So the original indicators, I think, are just a remnant of the past. The last thousands of years that they were, the last hundreds of years that they were there, they were eating primarily gazelle, and it seemed like they had really harnessed doing so efficiently. But my argument was that the initial carvings were indicators for what they were initially killing. So it would make sense in terms of the progress of their development as well. Let me bring up another photo. So these are the indicators. This is I really don't like this graph here because it all looks gray to me. But you'll see that the different enclosures have predominantly one animal. So a lot of them have a bunch of different animals, but they'll have one
main.
Yeah, one main highlighted animal. So enclosure D had snake, auroch, fox, gazelle. Enclosure A has snake, sheep, cattle, birds, quite a bit of birds. And then enclosure C, the focus is boar primarily. And then there's also sheep in enclosure C. And then structure C seems to be the dominant enclosure in terms of size and complexity. Structure D is intermediate in terms of importance, followed by enclosure B, A, F, and E. So let me...
You said they're keeping snakes. Like the painted skull thing to me could also be like an indicator of poison or danger with relation to something. I don't know if there's anything there.
I imagine if this was a place where several communities were coming to trade their own meat, their own kills, they would also want to be protective of the meat that is being stored. And I don't think that these were necessarily housed for a long time. It seems like it would be on a smaller timeline. But again, there's no way to be certain, but my idea is that this was a central meeting location and market for Gobekli Tepe and the surrounding communities to trade and store temporarily their meat and their kills. And if that were the case, they would want some level of protection. They found these skulls, these human skulls that were painted with ochre. And at least from what we can tell in terms of religious ideas that have developed since, is that, the dead can provide protection to some degree.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And could potentially ward off thieves if there are any thieves. But it could also just provide, protection for the food itself, which I also argue that same argument with Stonehenge as well. The ceremonial cremations of those that are buried around Stonehenge could have been providing protection.
Yeah.
And then about 28 miles from Gobekli Tepe, where there are these, huge enclosures, 28 miles away, there's Doireann Tepe, which we see these underground coolers, which are kind of making the same use of limestone. This is again limestone, and they're again in these T-shapes, which could maximize the amount of, if this had a covering, would maximize the amount of rainwater touching the top of it, absorbing downward, producing CO2.
Sure.
And then if it's covered, regardless of CO2 production, if this is covered, it's underground, which keeps cool and dry, and it's rodent friendly. And it also is maximizing the amount of surface area for that limestone, meaning whatever's inside is going to stay really cool.
Yeah.
And again, this is 28 miles from, so not that far from Gobekli Tepe, where they could have been making 2 stops or more than 1 stop. There are depictions of, phallic symbols and imagery like this in Recontextualizing. And someone on TikTok actually suggested that this could have been an indicator for husbandry. So people would, bring their sheep, their cattle from a long distance to mate and impregnate here with other people and their sheep and cattle, etc.
Sure.
Which would make a lot of sense for a community that is growing. And so, yeah, I love thinking about the different enclosures and the order in which they were built and what was carved on each enclosure. There is some discrepancy online. The most concrete knowledge that I have comes from journals that have actual images and photos of the carvings and their location, because there are discrepancies in terms of universities and what they're calling enclosure A and what they're calling enclosure B and
Sure.
C and D, etc. So there are some some contradictions. So the most accurate journals are the ones that have actual photos, just because there are some discrepancies there. But yeah, I see it as they built one enclosure, it was successful, they were growing, and
So they expanded.
building more and expanding more, and it grew to the point where they're not really, there's not as much of a need for certain animals, and they were predominantly just killing gazelle. But I like this idea of this being, a central meeting location. The people of Gobekli Tepe, we know, were fairly advanced in terms of their cereal production, because they left behind these tools that were hundreds and hundreds of these small little tools for cereal production. And some archaeologists say that they weren't that advanced, but I think that they were incredibly advanced with cereal production, and it would make sense that this structure had to do with food. And just to take another look at this T shape, this is a lot of additional work.
Yeah, it's more than just building
construct
walls.
and make this T shape if it's not serving a purpose.
Yeah.
And you can probably tell there are some holes and things on the top here that would again maximize the absorption of water, rainwater or ochre water, producing the same exact reaction in CO2. And you can see that this is like upper level here on this inner ring. We see also in the drawing a little bit better. But yeah, it's constructed in a way that's really preventing rodents as well and any critters from getting in. This could have also been used for smoking and for curing. We do know that they had some access to curing materials. Ochre also can be used as a curing material.
Interesting.
It is acidic. And we know that they were using a lot of ochre. There's a lot of different things that they could have been doing, but I imagine that they really would want to make use and use all of these larger kills. Auroch and lion, that's a lot of meat. That's hundreds of pounds of meat, you know?
Yeah.
And they'd probably want to be able to make the most of that. And it likely started, one of the earlier enclosures had a lion in it. So it could have even started with, we have this lion, you know, we have these lions that we could potentially kill and we need space for it, you know?
Yeah.
And along with smaller kills.
Yeah, and again, them being aligned to the stars, they're hubs. They need to be aligned to the stars so that people could find their way to them.
Yeah.
These are hubs. It all starts to make a lot more practical sense when you're looking at it like this. That's why so much energy was spent making these things. That's why we find them everywhere in the world. Mm-hmm. That's why they're all utilizing some natural principle, probably for the advantage of creating food for the survival of your culture.
Exactly. And we do see them all around the world and in different time periods where, you know, the underground is used and coolness and dryness is being maximized. That's Doireann Herold. We see this also in the Americas. So much later on in the early AD times, you know, 900 AD, and, you know, getting into some of the BC, you know, we have the Pueblo culture that developed these kivas that look remarkably similar to what we saw in Gobekli Tepe. And again, this is much later on. This is much more recent. And these are also often described as ceremonial or ritualistic spaces. But to me, I see a great space to have grain stored, to have food stored, dry, safe food. And of course, you know, there's so many different ways in which these spaces were used. But I do think the primary reason would have been practical, and these are kivas throughout the Americas, primarily in New Mexico and other areas. But they have this
storage, smoking meat. You know, it looks like a industrial oven kind of.
Yeah, it does. And there's also ventilation. So they have ventilation shafts in the kivas as well. And what's interesting about the Pueblo culture is that they were spread out and they were smaller communities, and it would make sense for smaller communities to have one location where they were putting their food or preparing their food or smoking their food. And there are ventilation shafts in these kivas. And I'm sorry, I misspoke. I said New Mexico, but they're throughout. So let me just make sure. So the American Southwest, throughout the American Southwest.
New Mexico, Canyon, Arizona, yeah.
Chaco Canyon hosts a lot of them. And they're just beautiful and so intricate, and there are carvings as well inside, and they're often described as ritual carvings. But I argue again that they could also be indicators
labels
or instructions
Yeah.
for their processes. A lot of them depict processes that are done on you know, in the day to day. So it would make sense for this to be, you know, very purposeful and deliberate. And of course,
yeah, because you know, even at small scale, that's a lot of engineering.
Exactly. And just to touch a bit on this idea that there, oftentimes our perspective here can sometimes recontextualize these spaces and these structures in not the most accurate light. This also happens with religious institutions recontextualizing spaces, and I just wanted to touch on that a little bit as well. We see this in the Americas again. This is known as Monk's Mound. The base of it is larger than the Pyramid of Giza, just to give you an idea of just how large it is. This is known as Monk's Mound. However, it was made by the Mississippian culture. It's located in Illinois. It's astounding and beautiful. And again, it was constructed, much later on than a lot of the structures that I've gone over so far. So the Monk's Mound, I think, was around 980. I have to double check that. But the reason why it's called Monk's Mound is because French Trappist monks settled on top of it and lived on top of it. And it was originally constructed, and that history was originally the Mississippians, but these, Trappist monks sort of recontextualized it, which to me is, a bit a bit disrespectful and disregarding of the ancestors that were there.
Yeah, they weren't really good at that back then.
Yeah, and we see this again happening in. So this is the mound at Cahokia. This is in Illinois. It's enormous, and those Catholic monks, the French Trappist monks, lived there in the 1800s. So much later on, not preserving that history, and we still call it Monk's Mound today, which is kind of disappointing. We see this again happening in Cholula, Mexico. This is a pyramid that was this ancient pyramid that was built in Cholula, Mexico, and the Catholic Church basically built a church directly on top of it, which, I don't know. If anything is sacrilegious, that's it.
Yeah, that would be it for sure. I mean, but that's what they did. That's how they conquered, Mm-hmm. That was the final sign. We got you.
Exactly. Yeah, it's really disappointing. So much history here, and the preservation research is, disrupted because of this,
Sure.
Research changes because of this. So I just wanted to touch on that a bit. There are so many amazing archaeological spaces to look into that are reflective of so much.
Well, there's a there's a guy on YouTube called Luke Caverns, and he does a lot of exploring in South America and Mexico and exploring these, because there's just so many ancient sites that are just consumed by the jungle down there. And there was one pretty recently, he was trying to lobby an effort to go document because they're about to flood the area. And people know that this site is there, but big money interests dictate we need to flood it for whatever reason. And they're just completely drowning, who knows what kind of history. LiDAR tells us there's all this stuff there, but they're just going to put it underwater. So it still goes on to today. It's not like we got better about doing that to an insane degree. We are better at doing it, but we're still pretty bad at just accidentally covering over important context.
Even in this context now where history is being purposefully, destroyed and ruined, it's absolutely disappointing. Yeah. And I was the end part here, and I'm happy to go over the Carol pyramids and the Egypt stuff as well. But I was just gonna say, I grew up where the I'm like technically sorry. Wait, do you do you want me to go into the Carol pyramids stuff?
Yeah, no, for sure,
Okay.
for sure.
Okay, so should I I don't really have, I'm just going to be doing this a little bit on memory. I don't have the images ready.
Well, that's not necessarily a big deal, and this can really, maybe this is what we go into super further detail on another episode on. But really, for me, the most intriguing parts of this are there are multiple people now who are coming up with ideas about what were the practical uses of these Egyptian pyramids and other types of structures. And there's a number of people that think they were used in the process of food production, in enriching nitrogen, or enriching soil with nitrogen, or kind of adding some kind of electro element to the water that they're using. I think that's kind of again, just an interesting way to tie it all in. Like, every culture maybe did it a little bit differently, but ultimately the goal is how can we ensure that we can make enough food to continue our culture? That was the only thing that the cultures cared about back then, was, can we continue? And how do you get a culture of thousands of people to live in abundance to where they have waste, right. They're throwing stuff away. So I don't know. I think all of that is important, even if you don't have images and stuff, just kind of talking about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think food preservation was something people were thinking about. These communities have probably lost people for various reasons. There's so many different motivating factors, even just not, long term, how do we survive as a society, but how do we make it through the winter? How do we continue to make it through winters? This recognition of patterns in climate and everything. This is what we do as humans. This is what we did as humans. What we'll always do is, recognizing the patterns around us and trying to survive. I think we've always been, thinking, how do we survive? Whether it's next week, whether it's next winter, and that was definitely, I think, a motivating factor for our ancestors, our collective ancestors.
Yeah, 100%. I don't know how you want to kind of crack into Egypt, but Egypt's another good example. It's like, how did they have a culture that was so big and could do so many things? They had to have food. Right. Regardless of an advanced understanding of leverage and ropes and stones, they'd have to have food. They have to have food to feed all those people. Exactly.
And with Egypt is remarkable just because of the amount of time. Our concept of Egypt is so limited compared to how many empires existed, how many empires rose and fell within the context of Egypt. And we have written record of so much of what went on in ancient Egypt. Unlike these other structures that I've talked about, we don't really have written record. So there's no way to have absolute certainty, but we have more understanding and certainty in regards to the history of Egypt because of all of these written records. And we know that they were making use of animals in really innovative, interesting ways, exploitative, but
well, sure.
Really,
I mean,
really
that
making use of
was the purpose. Yeah.
And so that's what I kind of examined and looked into when I first started making these deep dives, Egypt was my first starting point, and there's just so much to uncover. It goes on and on and on. Like, there's just so much to uncover with ancient Egypt, and I saw so many similarities in terms of our society now, our modern societies now, and how they relate to ancient Egypt in regards to hierarchy. With the other structures that I've looked into, there's not a definitive hierarchy, because we don't have that written record, and we don't have like a full scope or understanding. But with ancient Egypt, we see, this really intense hierarchy. We don't see quite as much slave labor as a place like Gengar Wat. We know there's so many slaves were used for Gengar Wat to exist, that was probably the darkest thing that I've researched yet, is just going into Gengar Wat. But with Egypt, a lot of the scope of what they were able to do was not entirely dependent on slave labor. A lot of the society willingly worked and produced this work and these structures collectively. But there was hierarchy, but not necessarily slave labor. So thinking about Egypt, I was looking at what they were doing and how it was similar to our modern day societies. And in terms of royal family, there's generally each empire, had a royal family and protected, secrets and everything in terms of how society was, conducting and functioning.
Sure.
There was that element of it, but I was also just really thinking about animals and how are they using animals, and why do we see similar structures in Peru with the Caral pyramids, so far away, but the structures are remarkably similar to the structures at Giza. So I began to think along the lines of how could they have been in communication? And I thought of this idea, maybe they were communicating via eel, but that's not actually the case. It's just impossible for that to have happened, but I was really hoping that could have been true, but it's just not. But I was looking into eels, and we know that the ancient Egyptians were using electric catfish and the Abba eel, which is an electric eel in the Nile. They were using electric fish for medicinal purposes. And they were also, conducting surgeries, brain surgeries, eye surgeries, skin surgeries, cancer removal. They were using the electric fish for migraines, for different electrotherapy purposes.
Like shocking people?
We know this too. This is not my theory. Like, this is what we know. So they were really, really advanced medically. And I started thinking, if they were using courier pigeons, basically, not pigeons, but birds. They were using courier birds. And we know that for a fact. They were also using insects in innovative ways. So I was thinking, they were probably using the electric fish in innovative ways as well, that we don't know of. Not necessarily just medicinal, but they were probably using them in other ways as well. That's kind of where my thought process was going. How are they maximizing these eels? Because we already know they were using them for medical reasons. And I started thinking a lot about the structure of the pyramids in and around Giza. What originally got me to thinking about Egypt was I read an article that they had discovered these pits, again pits, right outside of Giza, the north entrance of Giza, and I couldn't believe that they were just discovering this. I couldn't believe that after all of these years, they're
still finding new
like,
stuff.
This happened in 2023.
Yeah.
They found this completely built out room underneath the north entrance of Giza. So like the pyramids here, it's like further up and underground. It's a whole room, like a whole bunker.
Wow.
And I couldn't believe that they had just now discovered it. And so I was like, well, let me see if I can figure some stuff out. And that's when I was, going into all of this. But I was trying to imagine what they would have used that bunker for, how it related to the actual structures at Giza. I was thinking about the materials. They were, again, using limestone, which I've talked about, the temperature-controlled nature of limestone, as well as it being weather-resistant, but also absorbent, very porous. They were also using so many metals. They were making alloys that are even difficult for us to make now. They were making so many different alloys. They were making so much copper. Copper was their most used metal, and copper is extraordinarily conductive. I started thinking if maybe they had the ability to make a battery. We do know, in terms of the battery that was found in Iraq, that batteries have existed in history. So I wouldn't like
Rule it out.
Of course, we don't have any like direct evidence of that. The amount of copper and the use of electric fish, really, they could have been making a battery. A battery needs only a handful of things, and they had all of those things. A regular DC battery, not necessarily AC/DC, but a regular DC battery.
Sure.
They had everything available to them to make a DC battery, and potentially a really big one, like the pyramid.
Yeah.
Like the pyramid itself could have existed as a battery, but it's very hard to prove. And I've read a couple of journals where they touch on this. There's this one doctor in New Jersey that has produced a bunch of like kind of wacky theories in regards to the pyramid itself being a battery. And yeah, I don't know, it was fun to think about, but it seems much more speculative than my other research. And it led me
it's...
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and it led me also to look into the Carol pyramids as well.
And so what do you find there that is unique and different from all the other sites you had already looked into?
In Egypt? Or?
Yeah, in the Carol pyramids.
Oh, the Carol pyramids? So the Carol pyramids in Peru, I found, I don't know, I've definitely like, there's quite a bit of difference there. The Carol pyramids, the people of the area were eating a lot of beans and fish, and they were along these 3 rivers in Peru. And they were very connected with their environment. Like throughout the research that I've done, in similar ways to the other structures, the people in each area are very connected to their environment.
Symbiotic relationships.
Exactly. And with the Carol pyramids, their pyramids are set up very similar to the pyramids in Giza. And I think my argument basically was that they were maximizing their contact with light. So again, they were eating a lot of beans, and they probably wanted to be eating throughout the course of a year. They did not have flooding to rely on. All the way in Egypt, with the Nile regularly floods and is very abundant with water. The Caral pyramids in Peru, it was very arid, very dry. It probably wasn't always like that, but it became very arid, very dry. There are 3 different rivers, and there are these pyramid structures along the rivers, and we do know that there was at least some hierarchy based on food. So, the different areas ate different foods, but it could just be, because of where they were. But to me, it signals to me that the space on top of the pyramid, they were maximizing their contact with light. So at night, they're also getting starlight and moonlight maximized on their crops, essentially. So we know that they were using the pyramid to house their beans and their agriculture. We know that they were using a lot of fibrous materials, which could have been used for filtering water and making something like a fertilizer. They had this huge pool at the front of one of the main pyramids in the Caral pyramids, and it's debated whether or not there was water in this area, but I think there was likely water or soil.
Sure.
And they were filtering water, which is needed for fertilizer. And they had all of this fibrous plant material that we know that they were using for both netting and other things, also cotton. So I think they were probably filtering that water and making some sort of fertilizer for their beans. And they had these like apartment sort of setups on the pyramids. Unlike the pyramids at Giza, they were making use of the external area of the pyramids. So there were little homesteads potentially throughout the pyramids that housed their architecture, their agriculture in the architecture, and also possibly like little houses and homesteads within. They found a bunch of flutes within this pool in the front of it that have just one little hole. And I argue that it could have been a musical instrument as well as a siphon. We know that they were using gourds as containers, like reusable containers. They were using gourds. We don't see really any other containers. And I argue that they were likely siphoning whatever fertilizer was kept in that pool with the gourd and those flutes, which, doubled as a musical instrument. So I think that like the other structures that I've looked into, the people in the Caral pyramids were being as, proactive and efficient with their food and their environment, and preparing for, worst case scenarios, preparing for arid weather, preparing for winter, preparing for, you name it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just really crazy when you start to look at it like this, because a lot of the hardest to answer questions get boiled down super fast. When you start looking at it like this, a lot of the hardest questions about the connections and similarities with ancient sites all over the world, they start to evaporate when it's like we see these shapes and structures reemerge because those are just efficient shapes and structures. We see the alignments because they're maximizing sunlight and darkness. That's just what their entire civilization revolved around, is understanding my environment and continued survival of my people. And all of this stuff, it just, even I think we had talked about this on the pre-call, but electroculture, the idea where you just take copper wire and you like basically make a copper wire antenna and put it in your garden and connect it to copper wire lining your garden. It's supposed to boost the production of whatever you're trying to grow there. It's supposed to catapult it just by harnessing free electricity in the air. And, people have been doing that for a very long time. So like especially the Egyptians, using, like medically and even with just mummification, like their understanding of anatomy, like it's not surprising to me at all that they would be utilizing basic forces in nature to their advantage in every way possible. You said before exploitative. Yeah, it had to be like they were exploiting the shit out of those animals so that they could continue their life,
Well, also, so Egypt is interesting because the hierarchy is just so much more intense and the royalty is so much more protected, and we see, exploitation of animals to the degree that they had trained baboons as their guards, like they were high security. People don't really realize that when they think about ancient Egypt, but no one lived in the pyramids. Those were to house, the dead, and every single person that came in and came out of those pyramids were documented to some degree. It was a very tight ship. People don't think about it as being like a high security, situation where it's, comparable to a gated community or a gated,
or the Pentagon,
the White House,
or something like that. Yeah, exactly.
Except, there's like people going in and out. The things that happen within the pyramid, it's like very limited because the pyramid served a purpose, and it was to house, the dead, essentially. But that brings up like the idea of also exploitation and also manipulation. We see what's left behind from Egypt, and we always have to remember that we were seeing what's left behind. It might not necessarily be, an accurate picture either, in the event that like everything on the planet except billboards remained. What would an alien civilization say based off of just our billboards,
Right. Like, not much.
I sort of think of it like that, especially with ancient Egypt. I think of the opening of the mouth ceremony. I've done a very deep dive on that, and in terms of if batteries were potentially within the society and only the royal knew, how would that have come into play in terms of the opening of the mouth ceremony? We know that the tools that they used were conductive, and we have depictions of, the dead speaking, and there's a scribe that transcribes the message that the dead is saying, which could have been, deliberate. There could have been, some smoke and mirrors involved there. I suggest that there was, that they could have been, using the afterlife as a motivating factor for the public, and doing so by, showcasing that the afterlife does exist.
So you better behave yourself.
Through, a little bit of smoke and mirrors with this opening of the mouth ceremony and a little bit of electricity stimulating vocal cords, producing little sounds, no words at all, but little sounds.
Enough to amaze whoever was looking at it.
Exactly.
Then.
Like a show, like a magic show. Yeah. But that's all very speculative. But we do know that but it's not
of the mouth. It's not so crazy.
It's really not so crazy when you just look at how scientific their culture was as a whole. It's really not that crazy. All the things that you've talked about, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to do. Like those are things you can do with just natural forces, and for them at that time easily available resources. The types of stones they were using, the animals they had access to. It's really not so crazy, especially when people will make wild assumptions based on hieroglyphs about, less tangible applications.
Right.
Like the hieroglyphs can just be a visual interpretation of a much simpler thing that we think it looks like this, but it doesn't look like that. That symbolizes some other thing they were doing to harness electricity or to, I don't know, like none of this stuff is off the table in my opinion, because we just don't know. There's so many still unknowns. And like you were saying, we're still finding stuff
Right.
all over Egypt, South America, like all these megalithic structure sites. We're still finding that stuff. I think it's reductive for anyone to say, well, they for sure weren't doing that. Unless it was flying airplanes. You know what I mean? Like I think if it's a natural thing that did exist in that area, we have to at least entertain, like maybe they were doing that. Again, we're not talking about them building helicopters and airplanes, and we're not talking about that. We're talking about simple stuff they could have done with minimal understanding of stone or wood, rope, like you were saying. Like that's stuff that they had then. And if we get so spoiled with all the things that we have, but if the only thing your culture has is stone, earth, and what you can fabricate from those things, you're going to get creative. That's what humans do. We problem solve, we develop and evolve, and, even down to our genes, like reproduce, survive and reproduce. Like that is our programming, if we're going to look at it like that. So I don't know. The things you present and how you present them to me just become more and more tangible. And I really will not be surprised in the next couple of years if a lot of these things start to become like the more appropriate narrative. This hoping we don't get encased in mud or something, hit by a comet, but the digger we deep, the deeper we dig, the more we find. The more we find, the more of a context that it kind of gives us. So
Right.
this has been super, super intense. My brain is just like complete mush. It's so much information, and we've already gone over it, but it's just so incredible to me that like people will still, they want it so badly to be a Stargate. They're missing the forest for the trees. Like it doesn't have to be a Stargate. It can be the food production plant. That in fact makes way more sense.
Right. And there's this this way of looking at time that's actually from like ancient Mesopotamia, where the phrasing is you're walking backwards, progressing through time. And so much of what we do now as a culture, we think about the future as if we're facing it, as if we're projecting onto it, but that's not what's actually happening. It's much closer to what the Mesopotamians said. We're walking backwards through time. We have just the past to guide us. And just to tell you a little bit about myself, I'm from the East Coast, which was originally the land of the Quinnipiac, specifically the Memagoan, and they believed, along with several other native cultures in the United States, that the elders were the holders of wisdom and they were a valuable resource. And I think that collectively right now is a great time to look at the past for some answers and some guidance. Not that, like everything they did was right or correct, but we can gain a lot from that knowledge of
for sure
looking into the past rather than projecting into the future without, stumbling, projecting into the future as if we have some sort of, control over the future, or as if like our past is some mystical, romanticized, vague thing. We can look at the past really realistically, and it could potentially help guide us.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. There are so many aspects of modern existence that the more I look at it have nothing to do with life. It's all to serve like the culture that we exist in. And, sadly, I feel like it takes extreme scenarios for people to want to revert back to the past. But you're completely right. There's wisdom to be gained through all our successes and failures. But there's nothing to be gained by not, looking back to that.
Right. And it's not to say like any of my theories are right or accurate. I'm just, hypothesizing. And I think that it has provided me a lot of insight. It could provide other people a lot of insight as well. And it could be good for passing along stories, to, the younger generation that is going to be inheriting this very damaged earth, Yeah,
that's putting it politely. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, this has been killer. Let's wrap it up here, but I want you to go ahead and give people a shout out. Tell them where they can check out your stuff. I will, of course, include all of those links in the description of the video. So if you liked what you heard, please be sure to check out the associated pages and learn some more. But take it away.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me, James. This was really fun. Check me out on TikTok, Blessed Butt. And I'm also on YouTube. I'm going to be making longer content on YouTube coming up. Blessed Butt on YouTube as well.
Killer. Yep. I'll make a note right here to add this one.
And then I also have a Substack as well, which is Blessed Butt.
Amazing. I will have.
I'm not sure if I'll be staying on Substack. I might move over to Patreon.
Well, if you do, definitely let me know, and I can update that link. But I'll have those on there for people to scope out. You keep fleshing this out for sure. There's, especially with the amount of stuff that is being discovered even to this day, like this story just gets a little bit deeper with every new layer we uncover. And you're onto something here. This actually means something because it's believable.
Yeah.
This is a tangible thing, and with good reason why they would put all that time and effort into doing this stuff. And it's something that I feel like really is missing from all the other alternative interpretations of what these places were.
Yeah.
But all right, cool. That is it, folks. We are out of here. Check out the links below, and we'll catch you on the next one. See y'all.
This has been the Totally Legitimate Business Podcast. The end. With your host, James Oliva. Executive producers, Clint G and James Oliva. That's obnoxious. Sound design, mix, and master by James Oliva. Literally no one cares. For more Totally Legitimate Business, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Totally Legitimate Business, or add us on TikTok at TLB Pod. When will this end? Thank you for listening. Now get back to work. Move it along, buddy.